The Roman Gladiator Games. In 264 BCE, within the city walls of Rome, the sons of Junius Brutus Pera gathered to honor their dead father in a way that would echo through centuries. They arranged for combat between enslaved men, just 6 of them, facing off in brutal hand-to-hand contests. The crowds that assembled were intoxicated by the spectacle. Blood on sand, death as entertainment. No one could have predicted that this single funeral ceremony would birth an institution so vast, so profitable, and so intoxicating to the Roman masses that emperors would spend fortunes feeding it. The demand for spectacle grew. By the time Emperor Trajan conquered Dacia in 107 CE, the scale had become unimaginable. Thousands of gladiators now fought in grand arenas. The infrastructure was massive. Training camps called ludi, housing for fighters, medical facilities to heal those who survived. Weapons were manufactured en masse. The Colosseum alone, that massive stone amphitheater that still stands in Rome's heart, consumed the lives of perhaps 400,000 people and nearly 1 million animals across its 3.5 centuries of operation. These weren't quick executions. They were prolonged, choreographed displays of suffering. Men trained from childhood to become efficient killers, forced into combat with wild beasts, pitted against armored opponents in formations designed to maximize drama and death. A gladiator's training was brutal and methodical. Camps were run like military installations. Fighters were given names meant to inspire fear or curiosity. Some became celebrities with inscriptions left on walls by admiring fans. Others were slaves, property, whose lives had no value beyond their entertainment capacity. The crowds roared. Emperors gained political capital by sponsoring increasingly elaborate games. The violence became normalized, expected, ritualized. Poets wrote epics about famous gladiators. Children idolized them. The entire Roman economy became partially dependent on the games. Not just the events themselves, but the ancillary industries. Armor makers, weaponsmiths, sand vendors, medical personnel, animal traders. By the 4th century CE, Rome's treasury was hemorrhaging from the cost of these spectacles. Constantine, declared the first Christian emperor, recognized the unsustainability of the blood spectacles and issued a ban in 325 CE. Yet the games continued. Illegal or not, they persisted for decades. It wasn't until 404 CE, nearly 80 years later, that the Western Roman Emperor Honorius finally ended them. Legend holds that a monk named Telemachus rushed into the arena to stop a gladiatorial fight and was beaten to death by the crowd. His martyrdom moved Honorius deeply enough to enforce an absolute prohibition. The last gladiator fight occurred on January 1st, 404 CE. What had been entertainment for the masses was finally silenced, but not before it had shaped an entire civilization's relationship with violence and spectacle. The Aztec human sacrifice. In the great city of Tenochtitlan, atop the pyramids that dominated the skyline, a brutal theology drove one of history's most industrialized sacrificial systems. The Aztecs believed that their sun god Huitzilopochtli required constant nourishment, human blood, and human hearts to prevent cosmic darkness from consuming the world. Without these offerings, the sun would not rise. The world would end. And so, for centuries, the Aztecs organized sacrifice on an unprecedented scale. Historians now estimate that hundreds, possibly thousands of victims were sacrificed annually at the great religious sites. The city became a machine of organized death. Temples were built specifically to facilitate mass sacrifice. Priests were trained in anatomical knowledge, understanding exactly where to cut, how to work quickly, how to maintain ritual precision while processing dozens or even hundreds of victims in a single day. The ritual itself was elaborate and systematic. The chosen victim would be brought to the summit of the temple, often after being celebrated and honored, sometimes for days or weeks. 4 priests would hold the victim's limbs firmly against a stone altar called a chakmul. A 5th priest, the executioner, would raise an obsidian or flint knife, so sharp it could split a hair, and cut deep into the abdomen, slicing through the diaphragm. The hand would plunge into the chest cavity. The heart would be torn free in a single motion, practiced and precise. The priest would hold it aloft, dripping and still beating, offering it to the sun. The body would then be kicked or thrown down the steep pyramid stairs, where it would land among hundreds of others, the accumulation of blood creating a kind of dark stain on the stone that would never fully wash away. But the Aztecs understood something profound about psychology. Skulls were kept. Arranged on special racks called tzompantli, thousands of bleached skulls formed walls that visitors could see, that ambassadors could witness. This was not just religious practice. It was terrorism. It was power made visible. The Spanish conquistadors who arrived in 1519 were horrified and used this horror to justify their conquest. In 1521, Tenochtitlan fell. The Spanish demolished the Templo Mayor, paved over the remains, and built Mexico City on top of the ruins. The Aztec sacrificial system was obliterated, ending centuries of ritualized bloodletting. Sati, the widow burning. In medieval India, a widow's path was fixed and terrible. If a woman's husband died, she faced an unbearable choice: a lifetime of shame, social isolation, and degradation, or the flames. Sati, also called suti, was the practice of a widow self-immolating on her husband's funeral pyre. Rooted in Hindu traditions that were often reinterpreted through centuries of patriarchal control, it was justified as an act of ultimate devotion and spiritual merit. The original texts that supposedly endorsed sati were reinterpreted and weaponized against widows. But it was also a mechanism of control, a way to remove inconvenient widows who might inherit property, or remarry who might become a financial burden or a moral complication in a patriarchal society. The practice reached its peak between the 15th and 18th centuries. During this period, an estimated 1,000 widows were burned alive every year across India and Nepal. Some went willingly, driven by religious fervor, or social conditioning so complete that they genuinely believed their deaths were virtuous. Others were forced, drugged, or coerced by family members who saw their widow daughters and sisters as economic or social liabilities. The ritual itself was elaborate. The widow would be dressed in her finest clothing, sometimes decorated with flowers as if for a wedding. She would lie down beside her dead husband's body on the funeral pyre. As the flames rose, observers would beat drums to drown out her screams. The beating was deliberate, a way to minimize witnesses to her agony, to make the horror less apparent to those watching. This continued for centuries, with barely any legal opposition, until British colonial authorities arrived and recognized it for what it was: murder disguised as tradition. Lord William Bentinck, the Governor-General of India, enacted the Bengal Sati regulation in 1829, making the practice illegal. It was punishable by courts. By 1850, the British had hardened enforcement, with Sir Charles Napier ordering the execution of any priest who presided over a widow burning. The practice gradually declined, though it did not disappear entirely. The most infamous modern case was in 1987, when 18-year-old Roop Kanwar, a young widow, committed sati in Deorala, Rajasthan. Even in the 20th century, the practice could resurface. Today, sati is universally illegal across India, but its legacy of gendered violence justified by tradition remains a stain on history and a reminder of how societies can normalize horror through the language of faith. The Thuggee cult. In India, beginning in the 13th century and persisting into the 19th, an organized society of ritual murderers operated with terrifying efficiency. They called themselves thugs, from a Sanskrit word meaning concealment. They were professional assassins, sometimes called the world's first mafia, who combined murder, theft, and religious devotion into a synchronized system of predation. The mechanics were brutal in their simplicity. Thugs would infiltrate traveling groups, merchants, pilgrims, families moving between cities. They would gain trust through days or weeks of companionship, playing roles as merchants, pilgrims, or fellow travelers. They would share meals, tell stories, participate in the routines of travel. They would become part of the group's social fabric until the moment was right. Then, in the night, they would strike. A thug would throw a noose or handkerchief, the rumal, around the victim's neck, strangling them with practiced efficiency. The motion was fluid, learned through years of apprenticeship. No blood, no struggle, no witnesses. The body would be buried carefully, hidden from discovery, often weighted down in water or buried in remote locations. The belongings would be stolen and distributed. and the thugs would disappear into the next group of travelers, ready to repeat the process. Over 6 centuries, it is estimated that thugs collectively murdered approximately 2 million people. The structure of the cult was remarkably organized. Thugs belonged to hereditary groups, with knowledge of the craft passing from father to son. They worshipped Kali, the Hindu goddess of destruction and renewal, believing their murders were sacred offerings that maintained cosmic balance. One of the most prolific killers on record was Bahram, who operated in the Oudh district of India. Between 1790 and 1840, Bahram personally strangled at least 931 victims. His trial established one of history's most chilling murder tallies. The turning point in suppressing the thugs came with the Thuggee and Dacoity Suppression Act of 1836. British colonial authorities launched an intensive campaign to eradicate the cult. Hundreds of thugs were arrested, convicted, and executed. Bahram and his family were hanged in Jabalpur. The network was dismantled, though the last documented thug murders occurred in the mid-19th century. Today, the Thuggee represent a historical anomaly, a professionalized murder cult that lasted for centuries, killing millions, all while hiding in plain sight. Mayan human sacrifice. The pyramids of Chichen Itza towered above the jungle, and beneath them lay a system of ritual sacrifice so precise, so integral to Mayan belief, that without it the Mayans believed their gods would abandon them, and chaos would consume the world. The Maya, like other Mesoamerican civilizations, understood blood as the ultimate sacred substance. It was the nourishment of divinity. Blood was called cheek, and it was believed to contain the essence of life itself. And so sacrifice, the offering of human life, became central to their religious practice. The ritual itself followed a choreographed pattern. The chosen victim, often painted blue as a sacred preparation, would be led to the summit of a pyramid in elaborate procession. There, on a stone altar, they would be held firmly by priests known as chaks, who restrained the arms and legs with practiced precision. A high priest, the Nakam, would approach bearing a ceremonial knife made from the sharpest obsidian, volcanic glass that could cut with surgical precision. The knife would open the chest with an almost surgical cut. The heart would be removed and handed to the high priest, who would present it as an offering to the gods, sometimes placing it on a specially designed stone receptacle. The body would then be thrown down the temple stairs, joining the accumulation of previous sacrifices. But the Mayans also employed other methods. Victims were sometimes decapitated. Others were killed by arrows, the archers firing volleys into the bound victim's body as a form of ceremonial execution. At the sacred cenote in Chichen Itza, a massive sinkhole filled with water, people were hurled into the depths during times of drought, famine, or disease. The cenote was approximately 50 meters wide and dropped 60 meters to the water below. Archaeological evidence has revealed something disturbing. Many victims were children. In recent DNA analysis of remains from Chichen Itza, researchers discovered that a significant proportion of the sacrifices were not adults but young people, and among those, a remarkably high number were identical twins. Twins held special significance to the Mayans, connected to mythology about heroic twins who defeated the Lord of the Underworld. These rituals continued throughout the classic and post-classic periods of Mayan civilization. Only with the arrival of the Spanish conquistadors in the 16th century and the subsequent collapse of Mayan political structures did these practices cease. The Spanish, horrified by what they witnessed, used the sacrifices as justification for their conquest and conversion campaigns. Inca Capacocha, mountain sacrifice. High in the Andes, on peaks so elevated that breathing becomes difficult, the Inca Empire conducted one of history's most elaborate and heartbreaking sacrificial rituals. It was called Capacocha, or Capac Hucha, and it required the selection of the most beautiful and pure children from across the empire. These children, boys and girls, typically between 6 and 8 years old, though sometimes older, were chosen from noble families, representatives of the empire's most elite bloodlines. They were selected with the understanding that they would die. But before their deaths, they would be celebrated, honored, transformed into sacred objects of state devotion. During the great festival at Cusco, the capital, the chosen children were treated like royalty. They were dressed in fine textiles, given royal jewelry, and fed rich foods that would normally be restricted from children of their age. They were spoiled, honored, made to feel precious and important. This was deliberate ritual psychology. The Inca believed that the children needed to approach death in a state of happiness and honor, because they were transitioning into a divine existence where they would become intermediaries between the human and spiritual realms. The journey to the sacrifice site could take months. The children would travel across the empire, treated with reverence, supported by state resources. In some cases, the selection itself occurred a year before the actual sacrifice, allowing the child to undergo a gradual transition. During that final year, the selected children were given special access to coca leaves and alcohol, controlled substances normally restricted. Archaeological evidence of mummified sacrificial victims shows traces of coca and alcohol in their hair, chemical records of their elevated status during their final period of life. At the mountain shrines, the ritual would conclude. The methods of death were varied. Some children were strangled. Others were struck on the head with a heavy blow. Some were suffocated. In particularly cold, high-altitude locations, they were sometimes buried alive, left to die slowly from hypothermia or given drugs and left to sleep eternally in the mountain cold. The Inca wrapped some of the bodies carefully and left them on high peaks as offerings to the gods and the mountain spirits, the appease. Modern archaeology has recovered many of these mummies, preserved perfectly by the cold and altitude, allowing us to study the remains of children who died in ritual contexts 500 years ago. The Capacocha ritual served multiple purposes. It marked important events in the life of the Sapa Inca: his ascension, his illness, his death. It was performed at major festivals and at times of natural disaster. It was a statement of imperial power, a demonstration that the Inca could command the sacrifice of even their most precious children for the cosmic good. The practice persisted until the Spanish conquest in the 16th century, when it was suppressed as barbaric and unchristian. Pre-Columbian Mesoamerican sacrifice foundations. Long before the Aztecs dominated Mesoamerica, the practice of human sacrifice had already taken root in the region. Archaeological evidence points to the Olmec civilization, which flourished from approximately 1200 to 300 BCE, as among the first to institutionalize ritual sacrifice. The Olmecs built their monumental pyramids and conducted ceremonies atop them, establishing a template that would be followed by nearly every Mesoamerican civilization that followed. They created the religious framework that would persist and deepen for 1,000 years. The practice was not invented by the Aztecs. It was inherited, refined, and expanded across centuries and cultures. The Toltec civilization, which rose after the collapse of Teotihuacan around 900 CE, continued the practice with even greater systematization. The Maya, contemporaneous with the Toltecs, developed their own elaborate sacrificial theology integrated into mathematics, astronomy, and political power. Each civilization understood human sacrifice as a cosmic necessity. Without it, the sun would not rise, the gods would not be fed, the world would slip into darkness and chaos. This unified theological understanding, shared across distinct cultures and separated by centuries, suggests something profound about Mesoamerican cosmology: the belief that the universe itself required human blood to sustain, and that human societies existed primarily as providers of that sacred substance. Archaeological evidence from ceremonial centers across Mexico and Central America reveals structures designed specifically for sacrifice. Temple pyramids with drainage channels carved into their stone, channels that carried blood down the sides. Skull racks carved into stone, their surfaces worn smooth from handling thousands of skulls. Stone altars shaped to position a victim's chest at the most accessible angle for heart extraction. The architecture itself tells the story of systematization. What united all these Mesoamerican sacrifice traditions was an understanding that death was not an ending, but a transition, and that the deaths of humans served a cosmic purpose beyond the individuals themselves. Only with European conquest did this entire theological framework collapse, replaced by Christian theology that, while it had its own history of violence, did not require the same ritualized bloodshed. Carthaginian child sacrifice. In North Africa, in the city of Carthage, archaeological evidence has revealed one of history's most haunting ritual practices. Tens of thousands of small bones, arranged carefully in burial sites and preserved in urns, tell a story of systematic child sacrifice spanning centuries. The Carthaginians worshipped gods named Baal and Tanit, and the evidence suggests that during times of crisis, military threat, famine, plague, they conducted mass sacrifices of infants and young children. The discovery of these burial sites, particularly at places like Tophet, has provided archaeologists with detailed evidence of the scale and nature of the practice. The cemetery areas are filled with urns containing calcined bones of children. Some scholars debate whether all these deaths were sacrificial or whether some were natural child deaths being disposed of in a sacred location. But the concentration of remains, the arrangement of bones, the presence of markers indicating ritual positioning, and the correlation between the age of skeletons, predominantly very young infants, and historical records of crisis periods all point to organized sacrifice on a mass scale. The children were, in many cases, burned. Archaeologists have found evidence of heat damage on the small bones, indicating cremation temperatures. Urns bearing inscriptions in Punic script suggest that parents sometimes dedicated these child deaths to the gods in exchange for blessings or protection, as if trading their children's lives for divine intervention in times of desperate need. During the Punic Wars with Rome, when Carthage faced existential threat, the evidence suggests that the scale of child sacrifice increased dramatically. In her final days facing Roman annihilation, Carthage may have conducted mass sacrifices in a desperate attempt to appease the gods and secure divine intervention. This practice was utterly alien to the Romans, who had eliminated gladiatorial games and forbidden similar practices within their sphere of influence. When Rome finally destroyed Carthage in 146 BCE, this particular form of ritual killing was erased from the historical record, preserved only in archaeological remains and fragmentary historical accounts from Roman observers who were horrified by what they encountered. Celtic Druidic ritual practices. In ancient Europe, among the Celtic peoples, the Druids maintained a complex religious system that, according to Roman observers, included human sacrifice. Julius Caesar, in his conquest of Gaul, documented practices that suggested the Celts, under Druidic guidance, conducted ritual sacrifices. The descriptions in Roman sources describe large wicker structures shaped like men, filled with human bodies, and then set ablaze as offerings to the gods. These structures, called wicker men, were said to be filled with condemned criminals, prisoners, and sometimes volunteers. These accounts were likely exaggerated. Roman writers had every motivation to paint Celtic practices as barbaric in order to justify conquest and subjugation. Yet archaeological evidence include ding-bog bodies with ritualistic injuries and deposits of human remains in sacred contexts suggests that some form of ritual sacrifice did occur in Celtic societies. The Druids, as the intellectual and spiritual class among Celtic peoples, maintained oral traditions and religious knowledge. They conducted ceremonies at sacred groves and sites. They interpreted omens and advised on matters of war and peace. Some of their practices, according to Roman sources, involved divination through human sacrifice, reading the death spasms or entrails of sacrificed victims to determine the will of the gods. This practice of haruspicy was taken very seriously and influenced major tribal decisions. What makes Celtic sacrifice difficult to document precisely is the absence of written records maintained by the Celts themselves. Most of what we know comes from Roman sources with obvious bias, or from archaeological remains that can be interpreted in multiple ways. The practice appears to have declined as Celtic societies were absorbed into the Roman Empire, and the Druidic system itself was actively suppressed by Rome as a threat to imperial control. By the time of the Roman conquest of Britain, Druidic practices had largely been eliminated or driven underground. Ritual warfare and sacrifice in Aztec and Maya culture. Beyond the organized sacrifice at temples and pyramids, both the Aztec and Maya civilizations incorporated sacrifice into their systems of warfare and captivity. For the Aztecs, warfare was not merely a military matter. It was a sacred duty mandated by the gods. Wars were conducted partly to capture enemies, who would then be brought back to be sacrificed. Young warriors earned status and prestige not just through defeating enemies, but through the numbers of captives they brought back for sacrifice. The more captives a warrior delivered, the higher his rank, the greater his prestige, the more honored he became in Aztec society. This created a system in which warfare and sacrifice were inseparable. A warrior's honor was tied to the Vicky, Tim's he delivered to the priests. The Aztecs called this practice Xochiaoyotl, or flowery war, in which conflicts were arranged specifically to generate captives for sacrifice, sometimes as ceremonial contests rather than true wars of conquest. For the Maya, warfare similarly served sacrificial purposes. The capture of enemy leaders was particularly prized, and the deaths of these captives were recorded in monumental inscriptions and depicted in artistic representations. Archaeological evidence from Maya sites shows scenes of sacrifice following military conquest, with captured nobles being systematically executed in ritual contexts. These practices created a constant cycle: warfare to generate captives, sacrifice of those captives, the need to wage more warfare to maintain the supply of sacrificial victims. Only when these civilizations were conquered and their religious systems dismantled did the cycle finally break. The broader legacy of banned ritual practices. These 10 rituals, scattered across continents and separated by centuries, share a common thread. All were eventually suppressed, banned, or eradicated through external pressure or internal reform. The Roman gladiatorial games persisted for over 6 centuries before being finally prohibited. Sati continued in some regions well into the 20th century despite official bans. The Thuggee cult was systematically dismantled over decades. Some practices disappeared with their civilizations. Others were actively suppressed by conquering powers who used the practices themselves as justification for conquest and subjugation. The elimination of these rituals was not always motivated by pure humanitarian concern. Often it was about power. The Romans used barbarism as a justification for conquest. The Spanish used the Aztec and Maya sacrifices as evidence that these civilizations needed to be subjugated and converted. The British used Sati and the Thuggee as examples of native barbarism that justified imperial rule. Yet the eventual bans also reflected genuine moral evolution. Societies moved away from understanding violence and death as spiritually necessary. Legal systems developed that protected individuals from ritualized killing. Religious reforms and philosophical movements questioned the theological justification for these practices. What emerges from studying these banned rituals is a complex historical picture. These were not aberrations practiced by particularly cruel or primitive peoples. They were central to the cosmologies, political systems, and religious beliefs of sophisticated civilizations. Their elimination required not just moral objection, but the transformation of entire worldviews, the death of old gods and old certainties, and the emergence of new systems of meaning. The rituals were banned for good reason. The suffering they caused was real. The terror they inspired was deliberate and systematic. But understanding why they persisted for so long, why entire civilizations believed them to be necessary, forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the human capacity to rationalize violence when it is embedded in systems of meaning and power. These rituals, now universally condemned, stand as monuments to how far humanity has traveled, and how much work remains to be done to prevent new horrors from being rationalized through emerging systems of belief and control. Conclusion. What emerges from examining these 10 banned rituals is not simply a catalog of human cruelty, though they were certainly cruel. Rather, these practices reveal how deeply ritual and religion become embedded in the structures of civilization itself, how violence can be normalized and justified through theology, and how transformation happens only when enough people reject the frameworks that made such practices seem necessary or even virtuous. Each of these rituals had defenders, believers, advocates, who saw not barbarism but spirituality, not murder but sacred offering. The transition from acceptance to abolition was not sudden. It was a process of contestation, missionary work, legal reform, and gradually shifting beliefs about human life and human dignity. The Roman gladiatorial games that seemed essential to the stability and entertainment of Rome were eventually recognized as unsustainable and incompatible with Christian ethics. Sati, defended as a mark of female devotion, was eventually seen as a form of murder and was legally banned. The Thuggee, operating in the shadows for centuries, were finally exposed and eradicated through systematic law enforcement. What these stories collectively tell us is that the banning of these rituals was not inevitable. It required specific historical actors, specific moments of moral clarity or legal intervention, specific movements and reforms. In other circumstances, in other timelines, these practices might have continued indefinitely, and that awareness that the elimination of these horrors was not predetermined, but was achieved through struggle and change, should give us pause. It suggests that our current systems of belief and practice, our current justifications for violence and suffering are not inevitable either. Future generations may look back on practices we currently defend as barbaric or incomprehensible. The question is whether we will be on the side of moral progress or on the side of history that needs to be overcome.